The wind had a name in eastern Colorado. It was a mean, scraping thing that came off the high plains in 1881 and never seemed to stop. It stole the moisture from the air, the paint from the wood, and the hope from the people. It herded dust. Dust was the only thing that thrived in the town of Purgatory Springs. It settled in the lines of every face, giving the hungry a gray, corpse-like look. It coated the tongues of the thirsty and found its way into locked trunks. This wind was the only sound Clara Beaumont heard. It whistled past her ears, drowning the other noises, the shuffle of boots, the low coughs, the wet, nervous clearing of throats. She stood on a platform of raw, splintered pine, built for this very purpose, the town square auction block. She was 22 years old, and she was the last thing her father had left to sell. The bruise on her cheekbone was a day old, a dark plum color that pulled the skin tight. One of Elias Finch's men had put it there, not with a fist, but with an open-handed slap that was meant to sting more than break. It was a mark of ownership, a preview. Clara's bitterness was a cold, hard stone in her belly. It was colder than the fear. Her father, a good man who knew books but not men, was 3 weeks in the ground. Elias Finch, who owned the town saloon, its bank, and its sheriff, had seen to that. He had produced a stack of IOUs, lines of her father's familiar, looped signature, forged. Clara knew it. Her father had hated owing any man a penny, but Finch's forgeries were good, and Sheriff Hayes was paid to find them excellent. When the debt, a staggering sum built on lies and compounded interest, could not be paid, Hayes had seized their small, failed mercantile. When the mercantile's contents did not cover it, he had seized her. It was all perfectly legal, he had assured her, his eyes sliding past hers to rest on her throat. A marriage arrangement to settle outstanding accounts. It was a clean name for a dirty business. Now she was paraded. "Oh, looky here, gentlemen," Sheriff Hayes bellowed, his voice oily with false cheer. He was a thin man with a stained mustache and a star pinned to a hollow chest. Miss Clara Beaumont, 22 years, good teeth and raised proper. Her papa's debts are this town's burden, but his loss can be your gain. Men clustered at the foot of the platform. Drought-broke farmers with dirt packed deep under their nails, their eyes hollow. Miners, smelling of sweat and sulfur, their gazes rough and intrusive. Drunk cowboys from Finch's saloon, pushed out into the sunlight to hoot and holler. "What's the starting price, Hayes?" one of the miners yelled. $10, a cowboy shouted, waving a half-empty bottle. "I'll give 10 for a night." "This ain't for a night, you drunk fool," Hayes snapped. "This is a contract, a wife, for all intents. Bidding starts at $20. $20 for a fine, educated woman to clean your house and warm your bed." A wave of lewd comments rose. They speculated on her body beneath the worn calico dress. They joked about her proper raising and how long it would last. Clara stared over their heads. She found a spot on the gray, wind-scoured front of the dry goods store across the square, and fixed her eyes on it. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would turn to stone, her hands, tied loosely in front of her, clenched so tight her fingernails bit into her own palms. The pain was a small, sharp anchor in the sea of her humiliation. Elias Finch watched from the shade of the saloon's porch, a cigarillo in his teeth. He was a fleshy man, dressed in a waistcoat that strained across his gut. He was not bidding. He did not need to. He would let the others have their fun, let them drive the price up. And when they were done, he would step in and claim her. He wanted her broken first. He wanted her to know that every man had seen her, priced her, and that he was the one who would own her. The bidding stalled at $30. The farmers did not have it. The miners were cheap. $30. Gentlemen, a paltry sum, Hayes cajoled. This ain't some worn-out saloon girl. She can read. A slow, limping step sounded on the boardwalk. A man moved from the alley shadows into the harsh, dusty light. The crowd shifted. parting for him. His name was Thomas Greaves. He was a rancher from out on the Flat Rock Prairie, a man known for three things: his silence, his scars, and his haunted past. He was in his late 30s, but looked older. The left side of his face was a roadmap of ruined skin, pale and tight, pulling the corner of his eye and mouth into a permanent, grim set. The same scarred tissue vanished beneath the collar of his clean, faded blue shirt. He moved with a pronounced limp, favoring his right leg. He stopped 10 feet from the platform, his gaze steady. He was not looking at her body. He was looking at her face. Mr. Greaves, come to join the festivities?" Hayes smirked. Thomas Greaves said nothing for a long moment. His eyes, one clear blue, one clouded slightly by the scarred lid, held hers. Clara felt a strange, cold shiver, entirely different from the gazes of the other men. He was not pricing her. He was just seeing her. He reached into his pocket. The crowd went quiet, curious. Greaves was known to be poor, his ranch barely surviving. He pulled out a single coin. He flipped it in the air, a dull silver gleam, and caught it. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a voice hardly ever used. $1. A thick silence fell. Then it broke. A single cowboy snorted, and suddenly the whole square was roaring with laughter. Men slapped their knees. Hayes's face went purple with disbelief. $1. Greaves, you mad? "That's my bid," Thomas said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise. "He's buying cheap satisfaction," someone yelled, and the laughter turned mean. Elias Finch smiled, dropping his cigarillo and crushing it with his boot. This was perfect. This was better than he could have planned. She would be sold for a single, insulting $1. The humiliation would be absolute. $1? Hayes looked at Finch. Finch gave a tiny, imperceptible nod. Let it happen. $1. Going once. Hayes spat, eager to be done. Going twice. Clara's stony facade finally cracked. $1. She was worth less than a sack of flour, less than a broken mule. A single hot tear of pure, undiluted shame escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She looked down at the scarred man who had bought her. His face was unreadable. She saw the rough hand that had caught the coin. She expected him to climb the platform, to grab her, to drag her away to some filthy line shack to exact his $1's worth. The waiting was agony. The laughter was a physical blow. She leaned forward, just enough for her whisper to carry to him and him alone. The words tore from her throat, raw and broken. "Please, do it quick." Thomas Greaves held her gaze. He did not move toward her. The laughter was already dying as he tossed the $1 onto the platform. It landed at the sheriff's feet. Then, he did something no one expected. He reached into his other pocket. He pulled out not a rope, not a set of cuffs, but a heavy, black, iron key. He held it out, not to the sheriff, but to her. His scarred hand was steady. "The spare cabin. It locks from the inside." He did not wait for her to take it. He placed it carefully on the edge of the platform, just within her reach. Then, without another word, he turned. He limped back through the stunned, silent crowd, which parted for him like water for a stone. He did not look back. He just left. Clara stared at the key. It was solid. It was real. It was black against the white pine. Sheriff Hayes kicked the key. It skittered closer to her tied hands. "Well, go on," he snarled, his entertainment ruined. He untied the rope at her wrists with a vicious tug. "You heard him? You're bought. Get off my platform." She bent, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy metal. The key was a solid weight in her hand. She stood up, her legs shaking so badly she feared they would fold. She would not look at Finch. She would not look at the crowd. She clutched the key and stepped down onto the dusty street. The men watched her, their faces a mixture of confusion and disappointment. The show was over. A small, rickety wagon pulled by a single gray mule rattled to a stop beside her. Holding the reins was an older black woman. Her hair was bound in a tight gray wrap, and her face was a map of dignified lines. She did underscore, not smile, but her eyes were not unkind. "I'm Ruthie," she said, her voice quiet, like dry leaves skittering on hard ground. "I work for Mr. Greaves. Get in, child." Clara climbed onto the hard wooden seat. She did not speak. Ruthie snapped the reins, and the mule plodded forward, pulling the wagon out of the square, past the saloon where Elias Finch still stood, his face a mask of cold fury. The ride to the ranch was long. The town of Purgatory Springs vanished behind them, swallowed by the dust and the endless, rolling prairie. The land was vast and empty, a pale tan ocean under a white-hot sky. There was nothing to see, no trees, no hills, just grass that bent low in the constant, sighing wind. Clara's hand was wrapped around the key in her lap. It was the only real thing in the world. After nearly an hour of silence, broken only by the wagon's creak and the mule's plodding, Ruthie spoke, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "He don't talk much. Mr. Thomas." Clara said nothing. "Don't mean he ain't listening," Ruthie continued. "He hears things other folks don't. Hears the wind. Hears the hurt in things." She paused, guiding the mule around a deep rut. "He ain't like them men back there. You ain't got to be scared of him in that way, but he ain't easy. He's been through the fire. Came back. Different. He carries things. Heavy things." Clara looked at the older woman. "Why did he do this? Why buy me?" Ruthie was silent for another long stretch. "He paid $1, she said finally, as if this explained everything. "He sees a trap. He breaks it. Don't matter if it's a coyote or a person. Now he's broke it. He probably don't know what to do with you any more than you know what to do with him." The ranch, when they reached it, was barely a ranch at all. It was a small, clapboard house that had not seen paint in a decade, a listing barn, and a few struggling corrals. But the fences were mended, the water trough was full, a few chickens scratched in the dirt. It was poor, but it was not derelict. And set about 50 yards from the main house, near a stand of 3 struggling cottonwoods, was a tiny, separate cabin. It was little more than a shed, but it had a real door and a small window. Ruthie pulled the wagon to a stop. "That's it, the spare—" Clara climbed down. Her legs felt stiff and strange. "There's water in the pitcher," Ruthie said, not unkindly. "Some bread and jerky on the table. Outhouses behind the barn." She looked at Clara, a long, assessing gaze. "He sleeps in the barn, has for years. You're safe in that cabin, safest you can be out here." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She walked to the cabin. Her hand was shaking as she put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly. The door swung open. Inside, it was clean. It smelled of lye soap and old, dry wood. There was a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket, a small, 3-legged table, and a single chair. A tin pitcher and basin sat on a crate. It was stark, but it was not a cell. She stepped inside and closed the door. She turned the key in the lock. The sound of the bolt sliding home was thunderous in the small space. She stayed there, standing in the middle of the floor, for hours, as the rectangle of light from the window slid across the floor and climbed the far wall. Night fell. The silence of the prairie was different from the silence of the town. It was bigger, deeper, and it was full of noises. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of some small animal, the endless, crying wind. Her pride, which had shattered on the auction block, began to piece itself back together. It returned as a hot, simmering rage. She was not property. She was not a stray dog to be kept in a shed. That key in her hand was not a gift. It was a leash. He had locked her here just as surely as the sheriff had. She unlocked the door. The night air was cool. The moon was a pale sliver, offering almost no light. The prairie was a black, formless ocean stretching out in every direction. The ranch house was dark. The barn was dark. She would not stay. She would walk. She would walk east, back toward the town. She would find a way. She would do something. She walked. She put the cabin behind her, her feet sinking into the soft dust of the path, then finding the tougher sod of the prairie. She walked for 10 minutes, then 20. The wind pushed at her back, urging her on. She stopped and looked around. The ranch lights were gone. She was alone in a terrifying, bottomless blackness. The sky was so vast it threatened to swallow her. The wind did not sound like a friend anymore. It sounded like a moan. And then, a new sound. A howl. It was not the high, yipping bark of a coyote. It was a deep-chested, mournful, hungry sound. A gray wolf. It was answered by another, farther off, but not far enough. A cold, sharp terror, purer than any she had felt on the block, sliced right through her anger. The men in town were monsters, but she knew their shape. This was a darkness she did not know. It had teeth. She turned and ran. She scrambled, falling once, her hands scraping on the hard, dry earth. She found the faint outline of the ranch against the stars and ran toward it, gasping for breath. She reached the small cabin, slammed the door, and threw her entire weight against it. Her fingers fumbled for the key. She jammed it into the lock and turned it. The bolt shot home. She leaned against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She was breathing in ragged, sobbing gasps. Slowly, she slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor. She did not move to the cot. She curled into the corner, her back pressed against the solid wood walls. Drawing her knees to her chest, she clutched the heavy iron key in her fist. Holding it so tightly the metal edges cut deep grooves into her palm. Outside, the wind picked up, howling louder than the wolf. A low rumble answered it. Thunder. A storm was rolling across the plains. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to strike the tin roof like thrown pebbles. Then the sky split open. A crash of thunder rattled the very walls of the cabin, and the rain came down in a solid, driving sheet. Clara Beaumont closed her eyes. She was bruised. She was humiliated. She was a prisoner of a scarred man, a prisoner of the prairie, a prisoner of her own fear. But the door was locked, and for the first time in a month, the key was in her own hand. The gray light of dawn seeped through the cabin's single window, cold and unforgiving. Clara woke with a start, her hand still locked around the iron key, her neck stiff from sleeping against the rough wood of the wall. The storm had passed. The silence it left behind was vast, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. For a long moment, she did not move. She was still in the corner, still locked in. The fear from the night before, the wolves, the swallowing darkness, was a cold residue in her stomach. But beneath it, something else was stirring. Habit. Her entire life, she had woken with the sun. Her father, for all his gentle, scholarly ways, had believed in work. Work gives the day its shape. Clara, he used to say, without it, a person can come undone. She felt undone. Sitting here, a refugee in a shed, was a new kind of humiliation. It was idle. It was weak. She would not be weak. She stood, her joints aching. She looked at the cot, but it felt too intimate, too much like an acceptance. Instead, she used the water in the pitcher to wash her face. The cold shock of it cleared her head. She pulled her hair back, rebraiding it into a severe, tight plait. She was bruised. She was terrified, but she would not be idle. She unlocked the door. The prairie morning was brutal and beautiful. The rain had washed the dust from the air, and the sky was a high, aching blue. The land stretched out, greened by the night's water, looking fresh and new and utterly empty. Ruthie was already outside, scattering grain for a small, motley flock of chickens. She looked up as Clara emerged, her face as impassive as it had been the day before. "Mornin'," Ruthie said.
"Good morning,"
Clara replied, her voice sounding stiff.
I need to work. I cannot just sit."
Ruthie nodded slowly, as if this was the first sensible thing she had heard. "Wood basket for the house is low. Well needs pumpin'. Chicken's always hungry." She did not assign a task. She just stated the facts. Clara nodded, grabbing the empty feed sack from Ruthie's hand. "I can feed the chickens." The work was a strange comfort. The birds, all scrawny muscle and feathers, pecked at her feet, and she scattered the grain with a sharp, angry energy. When that was done, she saw the axe leaning against a large tree stump, a pile of uncut rounds beside it. Her father had taught her to split wood. Theirs had been a small pot-belly stove, but the principle was the same. She picked up the heavy axe. It was weighted for a man's hands, but she swung it. The first blow glanced off the hard, dry wood. The second bit in, but did not split it. She set her jaw, adjusted her stance, and swung again, putting all her shame and fury into the blow. The wood cracked, and on the next swing, it split clean. She worked for an hour, sweat dampening her dress, her back screaming. But a pile of kindling grew at her feet. She hauled water next, her palms blistering on the iron handle of the well pump. It was a deep well, and every bucket was a fight. She filled the trough for the 2 horses. She filled the barrel by the main house's back door, and then she filled her own pitcher in the cabin. Through it all, Thomas Greaves was a ghost at the edges of her vision. He was there. He came out of the barn as she was splitting wood, but he did not look at her. He moved with that halting, painful limp, his body angled away from her. He went to the corral, checking the fence line, his scarred hand running over the wood. He moved to the stable, and she could hear him inside, a low, murmuring sound. Not to her, never to her. He avoided her gaze. If she walked from the well to the house, he would suddenly find something vital to do in the barn. If she was at the wood pile, he would work on the far side of the corral. He never came within 20 feet of her. He never spoke. He never acknowledged her presence. The silence was a wall he built around himself, and it was a wall he built around her, too. She learned he slept in the barn. She saw him carry a blanket in at dusk and saw him emerge at dawn. The main house, which Ruthie kept clean but was clearly unused, was his by right, but he left it empty. He left it to the memory of whomever he had lost. This pattern held for days. Clara woke. She worked. She ate the simple, hard food Ruthie prepared, cornbread, beans, sometimes a bit of smoked jerky. She tended the small, struggling vegetable garden. She mended shirts. She scrubbed floors. And she watched Thomas Greaves. She was a watcher. She had learned to read men in Purgatory Springs, to see the intent behind a false smile, the cruelty in a casual glance. But Thomas was a language she did not understand. She saw the limp. It was not just his leg. It was his whole left side. It seemed to pull him down, a constant, weary weight. When the air was cold and damp in the mornings, he moved slower, his hand sometimes pressing against his own hip, as if to hold himself together. She saw his hands. The left one was a puckered, shiny map of scar tissue. The right was calloused and strong. One afternoon, she saw him with his horse, a bay gelding with a nervous eye. The horse had a deep cut on its fetlock. Thomas knelt, his back to her, and she watched him tend the wound. His scarred hand, the one that looked so stiff and useless, was impossibly gentle. He cleaned the wound, stitched it with a neatness that surprised her, and all the while he spoke to the animal. His voice was a low, rough whisper, a sound she had never heard directed at a person. It was calm. It was soothing. The horse, which had flinched from Ruthie, stood stock still for him, and she saw his fear. One evening, Ruthie had the old cast-iron stove in the main house kitchen roaring. She was baking bread. and the smell was the first good thing Clara had smelled in months. Thomas came to the back door, needing to ask Ruthie about some feed. He stood on the threshold, his gaze fixed on the older woman. A log inside the stove shifted. It sent a bright plume of sparks up the chimney, and a few snapped out through the grate, landing on the hearthstones. Thomas did not just flinch, he recoiled. He threw his right arm up, as if to shield his face, and took a stumbling step backward. The movement was sharp, violent, and full of a terror that had nothing to do with a few stray sparks. He hit the doorframe, his breath hissing in. Ruthie turned, her face calm.
It's just the stove, Mr. Thomas, green wood.
Thomas said nothing. He stared at the stove, his one good eye wide, his scarred one pulled tight. He visibly fought to control himself, his body rigid. Then, without saying the words he had come to say, he turned and walked, almost ran, back to the barn, his limp more pronounced than ever. Clara, who had been washing dishes, stood with her hands in the soapy water, her heart pounding. She had to know. The silence was worse than the shouting in town. The not knowing was a kind of prison. She waited until the next afternoon. He was by the corral, replacing a rotted post. He was driving the new post with a heavy sledge, the work straining his body. She walked straight up to him. He stopped, the sledgehammer resting on the ground, his chest heaving. He did not look at her. He stared at the post. "Mr. Greaves," he grunted, a bare acknowledgement. "I need to ask you something." He remained silent, his knuckles white on the hammer's handle.
Why?
Her voice was stronger than she expected.
Why did you do it? You paid $1. You gave me that key. You let me work.
She gestured to the ranch, to her own calloused hands. "You don't talk to me. You don't look at me. What am I doing here? Why did you buy me?" He was still for a long time. The wind whistled, pulling at a loose strand of her hair. She thought he would just walk away, as he always did. He lifted his head, but he looked past her, at the endless line of the horizon. His voice was raw, scraped. "It didn't buy me anything, miss. It was just—" He struggled for the words, or maybe just to use his voice at all. He finally turned his head, and his gaze met hers. His eyes were not cold. She realized they were just empty, burned out. "It was to stop it," he said, "to stop it from happening." He offered no more. He did not explain what it was. The auction, the shame, her fate at the hands of Elias Finch. He did not need to. He picked up the sledgehammer, his face averted once more, and swung it. The post rang with the impact. The conversation was over. He had stopped it from happening, but now it had happened, and he had no more of a plan for her than she had for herself. That night, Ruthie asked her to fetch a jar of preserved peaches from the main house cellar. Thomas was out on the range, checking for stray cattle, and would not be back until late. Clara felt a prickle of guilt, entering his house, but Ruthie insisted. "He won't mind, and my knees ain't built for those stairs." The house was cold. It was clean, but it felt hollow. As she came back up from the cellar, the jar in her hand, she paused in the main room. It was barely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a sagging sofa. On the wooden mantelpiece, above the cold fireplace he never used, sat a single, small frame. It was a tintype, warped and dark. She picked it up. The image was of 2 people, standing stiffly for the photographer, but smiling. One was a young man, barely a boy, 20 at most. He wore a brand new Union uniform, the brass buttons bright. He had a wide, happy, untroubled smile. His arm was around a young woman with dark, piled-up hair and a shy expression. She was pretty, but the image was damaged. The top right corner was melted. The tin bubbled and blackened. The edges were scorched, as if the picture itself had been licked by flames. That was Samuel, his brother. Clara startled, nearly dropping the picture. Ruthie was standing in the doorway. a basket of mending in her hands. Her face was soft with a sadness Clara had not seen before. "And Helen, Samuel's wife," Ruthie added, nodding at the woman. Clara carefully placed the frame back on the mantel.
"What happened?"
Ruthie sighed, a long, weary sound. She sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for Clara to join her. The house was growing dark, and Ruthie lit a single, small oil lamp. The flame was low. "Mr. Thomas went to the war," Ruthie said, her voice quiet. "He was older. He'd seen some things already. But Samuel was young, full of vinegar. He married Helen just before the fighting started. Thomas told him to stay, to protect his wife, his home. So Thomas went, and Samuel stayed." She paused, her dark fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "The war, it changes a man, but sometimes it ain't the fightin' that breaks him. It's the failin'."
"What happened to them?"
Clara whispered, looking back at the scorched photograph. "Deserters," Ruthie said, the word like a stone. "Not Rebs, Union men. Men wearing his own uniform. They'd left their posts, turned into a pack of wolves. They were robbing homesteads, taking whatever they wanted. They came to Samuel and Helen's place. It was near the garrison where Mr. Thomas was stationed. He was supposed to be part of a patrol in that very area."
"But he wasn't there,"
Clara breathed. "His patrol was diverted, sent on a fool's errand hunting for supplies. The deserters came. They wanted whiskey, money. Samuel, he was brave, but he was one man against 5. Ruthie closed her eyes for a moment. "They barricaded the door and they set the house on fire, just for the wickedness of it." Clara felt sick.
"My God."
Mr. Thomas's patrol came back. They saw the smoke from miles off. He knew whose place it was. He rode his horse till it dropped. He got there just as the roof was falling in. The whole place was an inferno." Ruthie looked at Clara, her eyes clear and sharp in the lamplight.
"He ran inside, while his men tried to hold him back. He ran straight into the fire, to get them, to get Samuel, to get Helen."
"The scars," Clara whispered.
"The scars,"
Ruthie confirmed.
"The limp, the fire took half his face, melted the muscles in his leg, ruined his voice. And for what? He pulled nothing out, just himself. His men had to drag him away. Still fightin', still screamin' his brother's name. He laid near death for a month. When he woke up, he was the man you see now. He came back from the war, but he didn't come back whole. He came back wrong." She tapped her own temple. "He don't just carry the burns on his skin. He carries the fire inside. He thinks he failed them, thinks he should have died with them. He's been sleeping in that barn ever since. Says he ain't fit for a proper house." Ruthie stood up, her joints cracking. "He never talks about it. Never. So you didn't hear it from me." Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, the single lamp casting flickering shadows. The silent, scarred man was no longer a mystery. He was a tragedy. His avoidance, his gentleness with animals, his raw terror at a few sparks, it all made a terrible, painful sense. He had not just stopped her auction. He had been trying to pull someone else from a fire. The knowledge opened something in Clara, a shared, unspoken understanding of loss. The next day, she found Ruthie shelling peas on the porch of the main house. Thomas was gone. Riding the fence line, Clara sat on the step. "Ruthie,"
she began, her voice low.
"Elias Finch, he didn't just take my father's store."
Ruthie's hands stilled. She looked at Clara. "My father, he didn't drink. Not like that. He owed Mr. Finch nothing. The debts were forged. All of it." The words came spilling out, a poison she had held for too long. "Finch he wanted me. He told my father he would overlook the debt if my father gave me to him. As a wife, he said—" Clara's hands were shaking. "My father refused. He called Finch a devil and threw him out of the store. 2 nights later, Finch came back with the sheriff. They said they were there to seize the property. I was in the back room, tallying the ledgers. I heard them arguing. My father shouted. He said, 'You'll take this store over my dead body.' And Finch said, "That can be arranged." A single tear tracked down Clara's cheek.
I heard a sound, a gunshot. I ran out. My father was on the floor, and Finch was just standing there, a pistol in his hand. The sheriff, he took the gun from Finch, and he put it in my father's hand.
"They called it a suicide," Clara whispered, the words choking her.
They said he was heartbroken over his debts and shot himself. Elias Finch murdered him. Ruthie, he murdered him in his own store, and then he bribed the sheriff to cover it. He put me on that block to finish it, to show everyone he gets what he wants, that I was just the last piece of the debt to be collected.
She was sobbing now, quiet, angry sobs. Ruthie said nothing, but her hand came to rest on Clara's shoulder, a heavy, solid weight. Neither of them heard the soft limp in the dust. Neither of them knew Thomas Greaves had returned early, leading his horse to the barn to check its shoe. He stood in the wide, dark doorway of the barn, not 20 yards away. He had heard every word. Clara looked up, sensing something, and her eyes met his. His face was a terrible thing to see. It was not anger, not pity. It was a dead, hollow recognition. The scars on his cheek stood out, stark and white. He had heard her story, a story of murder, of powerlessness, of a man failing to protect his own. It was a mirror of his own. He did not speak. He did not move. He just stared at her, the abyss of his own failure looking into hers. Then, with a jerky, painful movement, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the barn. Clara's heart seized. She had said too much. She had burdened this broken man with her own broke underscore and story. She had made a terrible mistake. That night, the air was thick and hot, promising another storm. Clara could not sleep. She paced the tiny cabin, her mind racing. She had exposed herself. She had told his only friend that the most powerful man in town was a murderer. She had put them all in danger. A soft sound at her door, a knock. She froze, her blood running cold.
Finch! Had he followed her?
"Who is it?" No answer, just the scrape of leather on wood. She crept to the door, the key in her hand. She opened it a crack. No one was there. The porch was empty, but on the rough wooden boards sat two things. One was a heavy Navy Colt revolver, its metal dark in the moonlight. The other was a small, worn leather pouch tied with a drawstring. She looked out into the yard. Thomas was a shadow, standing by the barn door. He did not look at her. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp that barely carried. "You can run or stay." He did not wait for an answer. He turned, and the barn door creaked shut, swallowing him completely. Clara stared at the items. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely untie the pouch. She loosened the string and poured the contents into her palm. Coins, silver dollars, $half, quarters. It was a lot of money, far more than the $30 she had fetched at auction. It was enough for a stagecoach ticket, enough to get her to Denver, maybe even further, enough to disappear. She brought the gun and the money inside. She locked the door. She sat on the cot, the gun heavy in her lap, the coins cold in her hand. This was a choice, a real one. He had not just given her a locked door. He had given her freedom. He had given her a weapon to protect herself and the money to run. He was giving her the chance he never had, to escape before the fire started. She could run, she could take this money, buy a ticket, and be gone by morning. She could leave this endless, terrifying prairie, leave Elias Finch, and leave this haunted, silent man who had just given her everything he had. Or she could stay. She could stay on a failing ranch with a scarred man who flinched from fire and slept in a barn. She could stay with a kind old woman who saw too much. She could stay in the place where her father's murderer ran the town. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window, the gun on the table, the pouch of coins beside it. She watched the moon trace its path across the sky. She thought of her father's courage. She thought of Samuel and Helen in their burning house. She thought of Thomas, running into the flames. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gray. The storm had broken elsewhere. Clara stood up. She picked up the revolver, checked it was unloaded, and placed it on the small table. She picked up the pouch of coins. She unlocked her door and stepped out onto the porch. Thomas was already at the corral, his back to her. He was hauling hay, his movements stiff. He, too, had clearly not slept. Clara walked to the edge of her small porch. She set the pouch of coins down on the top step, in plain view. Then she turned, picked up the 2 empty water buckets from beside her door, and walked past the porch. She walked past the barn. She walked past Thomas Greaves, her head held high, on her way to the well. He did not turn, but she knew he had seen. The coin sat untouched. The gun was in her cabin. The buckets were in her hands. The choice was made. The morning after Clara left the coins on the porch, a new silence settled over the ranch. It was not the empty, avoiding silence of before. It was a silence of acknowledgement. A choice had been made, and the day's work had to begin. When she came out of her cabin, Thomas was standing by the corral. He did not look at her, but he did not walk away. He was holding the heavy Navy Colt revolver. He held it out to her, but first. "You stay," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You learn to use it." Clara took the gun. The weight of it surprised her, cold and solid. It was heavier than the axe, heavier than the water buckets. It was the weight of a final decision. He motioned with his head toward the open prairie, away from the house. "Come!" He led her to a shallow, dry arroyo 1/2 mile from the barn. The high, crumbling dirt walls would stop a stray bullet. He pulled a single tin can from his pocket and set it on a rock 30 paces away. "You know this?" he asked.
"I have fired a rifle, once, at a rabbit. I missed,"
Clara said. "This is not a rifle," he said. He showed her how to load it, his scarred hand quick and practiced, the good one sliding the cartridges into the cylinder. He did it twice, then handed her the bullets. "You!" Her fingers fumbled. The cartridge felt strange, oily. Thomas watched, his face impassive. He did not offer to help. He just waited until she had the cylinder loaded. "Now," he said, "stand." She raised the gun, both hands, pointing it toward the can. It wavered. "No," he said. His voice was not unkind, just firm. He moved, standing beside her. She could smell the lye soap on his shirt, mixed with dust and the faint, clean smell of horses. He was close, closer than he had ever been. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, but he did not touch her. "Your feet," he said. "Apart, like this." He nudged her boot with his own. "Now, your arm, straight, but not locked. Feel the weight of it. Do not fight it. Let it be part of your arm." She adjusted, breathing in the smell of him. She raised the gun again. "It will kick," he said, stepping back. "It will kick hard. Do not be surprised by it. Expect it. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." Clara took a breath. She stared at the small, distant can. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The gun bucked in her hand, slamming her wrist back. The sound echoed off the arroyo walls. She had flinched, her eyes shut. The can was untouched. "Again," he said. She fired again. A puff of dust flew a foot to the left of the can. "You are pulling. You are afraid of the sound," he said. "Do not be afraid of it. Use it again." She fired 4 more times. On the last shot, the can jumped into the air and clattered back onto the dirt. A clean hole was punched through its middle. A small, sharp feeling of triumph shot through her. She looked at Thomas. He gave a single, curt nod. "Reload." He taught her how to shoot. He taught her how to ride. She had ridden side saddle, as a proper lady did, but that was useless for ranch work. He and Ruthie found her a pair of old denim trousers, worn soft, that had belonged to someone long gone, The first time she put them on, she felt scandalous and, for a moment, wonderfully free. Thomas taught her to saddle her own horse, a quiet mare named Dust. He was a patient teacher, but a silent one. He showed her, once, how to tighten the cinch, how to check the bit. Then he stood back and made her do it. "You must be able to do it in the dark," he said. "You must be able to do it in the rain. You must be able to do it when you are scared." He taught her how to sit astride, how to use her legs, how to become part of the horse. "The reins," he said, his hand gesturing, "are for asking. Your legs are for telling. A good rider does not need to shout." She fell. She fell when the mare shied at a snake, landing hard in the dust. Thomas just rode up, looked down at her, and waited. She got up, bruised and angry, and he nodded at the horse. "You fall, you get up, you get up, you get back on." In the weeks that followed, he began to teach her the cattle. It was a small herd, just over 30 head, all bones and horns. But they were his livelihood. He taught her how to move them, how to ride the edge of the herd to turn them, how to spot a sick calf. They worked together, two silent figures in the vast, open land. They communicated in nods, in pointed fingers, in small hand gestures. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer a wall. It was a shared space. One afternoon, a young, stubborn calf broke from the herd and ran toward a thicket of brush. "Get him!" Thomas called out. Clara wheeled the mare, her heart pounding. This was a test. She chased the calf, trying to get ahead of it to turn it back. It dodged her. She was a clumsy rider still, bouncing in the saddle. She swung her rope, a poor, amateurish loop that missed by a yard and spooked the calf into a faster run. She spurred the mare, kicking up dust, finally getting in front of it. The calf stopped, stared at her, then bolted right past her. Clara spun the mare too fast. The horse stumbled, and Clara, unbalanced, slid ungracefully from the saddle, landing on her backside in a patch of soft grama grass. She sat there, stunned, her hat knocked over her eyes. She was covered in dust, her pride stinging. The calf was now just a dot in the distance. Thomas rode up, his own rope coiled neatly at his saddle horn. He had not even tried. He just watched her. Clara pushed her hat back. She looked at the grass stains on her trousers, at the disappearing calf, and then at his scarred, serious face. A bubble of frustration and pure absurdity rose in her throat. She started to laugh. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a full, open-mouthed laugh, a sound she had not made in months. It was a laugh that shook her shoulders and brought tears to her eyes. Thomas just watched her. His face did not change. But as her laughter died down, she saw it. The corner of his good eye was crinkled. The lines were tight. His mouth, under the pull of the scar, was not smiling. But his eye was. It was the nearest thing to a smile she had ever seen from him, and it was more valuable than gold. He did not say a word. He just nudged his horse into a slow lope, and with an effortless, beautiful flick of his wrist, his rope sailed out and settled perfectly over the calf's head. The air grew colder. Autumn was coming to the high plains, sharp and sudden. The wind had a new bite. Clara spent her evenings in the main house kitchen, sharing the small space with Ruthie. The two women would mend clothes, shell beans, or just sit in the companionable silence, listening to the wind howl. Thomas, who had always vanished into the barn at dusk, began to linger. He would sit at the far end of the kitchen table, his hat in his lap, cleaning his tack or oiling the mechanism of a rifle. He did not speak, but he was there. He was sharing their light. One night, he came in from the cold, his old canvas coat, the one he always wore, held in his hand. It was torn at the elbow, a long, gaping rip. He walked to the table and, without a word, held it out to Clara. It was a request, an act of trust. "The canvas is thick," she said, taking it. "It will need a strong needle." He nodded and retreated to his chair in the shadows. Clara set to work. Ruthie had already gone to her small room off the kitchen. The only sounds were the scratching of Clara's needle, the soft brush as Thomas oiled his saddle leather, and the rising shriek of the wind outside. She bent her head to the work, the lamplight falling on her hands and the rough brown fabric. The needle was stubborn, the canvas stiff with dirt and age. She had to push it, hard, using the thimble Ruthie had given her. She was finishing the last stitch when the needle slipped. It did not just prick her, it drove deep into the pad of her index finger. "Ah!" she hissed, a sharp intake of breath. She dropped the coat, pulling her hand back. A bright, perfect bead of blood welled up from the puncture. Before she could even reach for a rag, he was there. He moved faster than she had ever seen him move, his limp almost gone in the short, sudden lurch. He was out of his chair and beside her in a single step. He did not ask. He did not hesitate. He gently, firmly took her hand. His grip was rough. His scarred left hand, which he rarely used, came up to support her wrist, while his calloused right thumb and forefinger closed around her hand. He held it up to the lamplight, inspecting the small, bleeding wound. Clara stopped breathing. It was the first time he had ever touched her. His skin was dry and warm, calloused from work, but his touch was so gentle it was agonizing. He held her fingers, and she saw, in the yellow light, that his hand was trembling. His whole body was rigid. He was staring at the drop of blood on her finger as if it was the only thing in the world. He was trembling from the sheer, catastrophic effort of this simple, human contact. Clara said nothing. She did not pull away. She just let him hold her hand. She watched the tremor in his scarred knuckles. She watched the concentration on his face. He seemed to be fighting a war within himself, and this small touch was the battlefield. He held her for a long, silent moment. 10 seconds, a minute, an eternity. Then, as if touching fire, he released her. He dropped her hand, not unkindly, but with a terrible finality. He stepped back. "It is done," she whispered, her voice shaking. She nodded at the coat on her lap. Thomas looked at the coat, then at her. He seemed unable to speak. He gave a sharp, jerky nod, grabbed his hat from the table, and walked straight out the back door, into the cold, dark night. Clara sat, staring at her hand. She slowly lifted her finger and touched the bead of blood to her own lips. They knew it was coming. They had seen a rider on the high ridge to the east a few days before, a solitary figure who watched the ranch for an hour and then disappeared. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. Ruthie was kneading dough in the kitchen. Clara was outside, hanging laundry on the line. The white sheets snapped in the constant, cold wind. 2 men rode into the yard. They were not from around here. They were hired men, wearing city hats and carrying their guns low and tied down. One was a thick, bull-necked man with a dead-looking eye. The other was slighter, weaselly, with a constant smirk. Clara froze, a wooden pin in her hand. The weasel-faced man, Jake, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well now, Bart, looks like the lady of the house is doing chores." Bart, the bull-necked one, just stared at Clara. It was the look from the auction, the look that stripped her bare and turned her into an object. "Mister, Elias Finch is a patient man," Jake said, his voice conversational. "But his property has been gone a long time. He's looking to collect." "I am not his property," Clara said, her voice tight. "That ain't what the contract says, ma'am." Jake smiled. "Says you were bought and paid for. Mr. Finch, he paid off that $1, mister. Greaves put down. And he paid off that forged debt your daddy left. He figures you owe him, or, if you prefer, he'll take $200, double the forged sum. Cash." The back door of the barn slid open. Thomas emerged. He was not wearing his gun. He was holding a pitchfork. He did not walk quickly. He limped, Each step measured, and stopped 10 feet from the horses. The pitchfork held loosely. "Tines down." "Get off my land," he said. Jake laughed.
"This ain't your land. Greaves. This is Finch's land. He holds the note on this sorry patch of dirt, same as he held the note on the girl's daddy. You're both just squatters here."
Bart dismounted. He was a big man, and he moved with a heavy, arrogant confidence. "Finch wants the girl. He don't care about you. Give her to us. We'll even leave you the pitchfork." Bart started to walk toward Clara. "No," Thomas said. He raised the pitchfork, the tines now level with Bart's chest. "You gonna stop me with that?" Bart sneered. He lunged, grabbing for the fork. It was a mistake. Thomas was not a brawler, but he was a man forged in fire and desperation. He was fast. He sidestepped Bart's lunge, reversed the pitchfork, and brought the heavy wooden handle down in a brutal, cracking arc across Bart's wrist. A wet, sharp snap. Bart screamed, a high, thin sound, and collapsed, clutching his shattered arm. Jake, still on his horse, cursed and fumbled for his revolver. "You broke his arm. You crazy." He never finished. Thomas was already moving. He left the pitchfork and launched himself at Jake. Grabbing his gun hand, he dragged the smaller man from the saddle, and the two of them hit the dirt. It was not a fight. It was an explosion. Thomas was all rage and pain, his breath hissing through his teeth. He slammed Jake's head against the hard-packed earth. Jake's gun went off, the bullet harmlessly burying itself in the dirt. Bart, recovering, pulled a long knife with his good hand and scrambled to his feet, screaming with rage, "I'll kill you, you scarred bastard!" Clara screamed, "Thomas, behind you, the knife!" Thomas turned from the dazed Jake, rolling to his feet. Bart was on him, the knife slashing. Thomas raised his left arm, his scarred, ruined arm, to block it. The knife bit deep into the dead, thick tissue. Thomas did not even grunt. He did not feel it. He grabbed Bart's knife hand with his own good hand and squeezed. The sound of bones grinding made Clara feel sick. Bart screamed again as his fingers were crushed. Thomas punched him, once, twice, in the throat. Bart fell, choking and gagging. Thomas stood over them, breathing like a winded animal. His chest was heaving. The front of his shirt was dark with blood from his arm. And his face, his scars were no longer pale. They were flushed a deep, terrifying red, glowing with the blood and the fury that pumped through him. He looked like a demon pulled from a fire. He turned and saw a shovel leaning against the corral. He grabbed it, raising it high over Bart's head. "Thomas, no!" Clara screamed. She ran to him, grabbing his good arm. "Please, do not kill him. You are not him. You are not Finch." Her words cut through the red haze. He froze, the shovel held high. He stared at the choking, bloody man at his feet. He looked at Clara, her hands clamped on his arm, her face white with terror. The rage did not vanish, but it receded, pulled back like a tide. He was shaking. He lowered the shovel, driving the blade into the dirt. He looked at Jake, who was crawling backward, his eyes wide with terror. "Get up!" Thomas rasped. His voice was ruined. "Take him. Ride back to Finch." Jake scrambled to his feet. "Tell him," Thomas continued, each word heavy, "that this is my land. Tell him the girl is not his. And tell him I know what he did to Amos Beaumont. I know he was murdered. Tell him if he sends anyone else. I will not stop." Jake, pale and shaking, dragged the groaning, shattered Bart to his horse. It took him 2 tries to heave the bigger man into the saddle. He mounted his own, never taking his eyes off Thomas. Then he wheeled the horses and galloped out of the yard. Clara was left alone with Thomas. He stood, still trembling, the blood dripping from his left arm onto the dust. "You are hurt," she whispered. She reached out, her hand hovering over the long, deep slash in his arm. He flinched. He flinched away from her touch, his whole body recoiling.
The rage was still too close. The violence had broken his careful walls.
"I am all right," he choked out. He would not look at her. He turned and walked, his limp heavy and painful, to the water trough. He plunged his head and his bleeding arm into the cold water, his back rigid, his shoulders shaking. That night, the storm came. It was not a gentle rain. It was a high plains thunderstorm, a war in the sky. Wind lashed the small house, and rain hit the windows like thrown gravel. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations. Ruthie had gone to bed, but neither Clara nor Thomas could sleep. The violence of the afternoon hung in the air, thick and metallic. They sat in the kitchen. Thomas was at the table, his arm bandaged with a clean rag. Clara had insisted on cleaning the wound, and he had let her, sitting rigid as a fence post, his eyes closed. The knife had cut deep, but the scarred flesh had not bled as much as it should have. Clara stood by the cold fireplace, watching the rain distort the blackness in the window pane.
"I have nightmares,"
she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Thomas did not move, but she knew he was listening. "About that day, the auction." She wrapped her arms around herself. "It is not what you think. It is not the fear of being hurt. It was the staring." She turned to look at him, a shadow at the table. "The way they looked at me, like I was not human, like I was a horse, a piece of equipment, something to be used and thrown away." She shuddered, the memory coiling in her stomach. "It makes me feel sick, dirty, like I can never wash it off. Elias Finch, he took my father. He took my home. But those men, they took me from myself, and I hate them for it." She looked at him, at the dark shape of his head, the way the lamplight caught the scarred edge of his face. "I hated all of them. I hated every man in that town. I was ready to hate you. I tried to hate you." She took a step closer. "But you never looked at me that way. You never once laid a hand on me. Not until today, to hold my hand." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You are the first man I have not hated." He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the rain, a furious drumming on the roof. He lifted his head, and his face was a mask of old, settled sadness. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. His voice was so soft, she barely heard it. "Then I must be doing something wrong." She did not understand his words, did not grasp the deep, bitter self-loathing behind them. She only heard the pain. She only felt the pull, the impossible connection between two broken, scarred things. She moved, closing the distance between them. She stood in front of the table. He looked up at her, and his good eye was clear and deep and full of a sorrow she recognized. He stood up. He was taller than she, and he seemed to fill the small, dark kitchen. The air between them was electric, thick with the storm outside and the tension inside. He smelled of rain and soap and blood. She lifted her chin. He leaned in, slowly, his gaze fixed on her mouth. His right hand, his good hand, lifted. It was trembling, just as it had been when he touched her finger. He wanted to touch her face. She could see the desperate, warring need in his eyes. He came closer, an inch. She could feel his breath. He squeezed his eyes shut. A tremor ran through his whole body. "I cannot," he whispered. The words were torn from him. He turned, his limp more pronounced than ever, and walked to the back door. He opened it and walked out, disappearing into the lashing rain and the darkness. Clara was left alone, her heart pounding, her body aching with a strange, new emptiness. She eventually made her way back to her own cabin, the wind nearly tearing the door from her hand. She fell onto her cot, exhausted, and slept. She dreamed. It was not the nightmare of the auction, of the staring, leering faces. She dreamed of Thomas. They were in the cabin, and the storm was raging outside. But she was not cold. He was holding her. His arms were wrapped around her, and her head was on his chest. He was not touching her with hunger. He was not grabbing her or demanding anything. He was just holding her. His arms were a wall against the wind. His body was a shield against the fire. It was not desire. It was warmth. It was shelter. It was the first time she had felt safe, truly safe, since her father died. She woke up suddenly in the pitch black. The cabin was cold. The storm had passed, and the silence was absolute. She was alone. The feeling of the dream, that profound, desperate need for warmth and safety, was so real, and its absence was so painful that a single hot tear escaped her. She curled onto her side, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. She pressed her face into the rough pillow, and, for the first time, she wept. Not from fear, not from humiliation, but from loneliness. She wept alone in the dark, for the man who was too broken to even touch her. The week that followed the fight was worse than the silence. Thomas was a ghost, a raw, exposed nerve. He had shown his fury, not to Finch, but to her, and the shame of it drove him deeper into himself. He worked from before sunup until well after dark, avoiding the house, avoiding her, as if his very presence was a contamination. He was punishing himself, seeking exhaustion, pushing his body to the point of breaking. The knife wound in his scarred arm, the one he had dismissed, did not heal. The flesh was old, dead, and unwilling to mend. It seeped. Clara saw him wince when he lifted the axe, but he did not stop. The red line of infection crept from the bandage, tracing a path up his arm. They needed to bring the cattle in. It was a small herd, their only buffer against the coming winter, and they were scattered across the high range. "You are not well," Clara told him at dawn, standing by his horse. "The wound, it is festering." "It is nothing," he rasped, swinging into the saddle. He winced, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, and she saw him sway for a second. "Thomas, you are in no condition to ride. The cattle must be brought in," he said. It was final. He nudged his horse into a walk. Clara, her jaw set, ran for the mare. She saddled Dust in under a minute, her hands sure and practiced. She would not let him go alone. They rode for hours under a sky the color of a dull, unpolished knife. The work was hard, finding the stupid, stubborn animals in gullies and thickets. Thomas rode with a reckless, frantic energy, pushing himself and his horse. Clara watched him, her heart a cold knot of dread. She saw the fever on him long before he admitted it. His face was flushed, but his lips were pale. A sheen of sweat covered his skin, and it was not from the work. The day was cold. "We should go back," she called out to him, as they pushed the last 5 head toward the south range. "Almost done," he muttered, his voice thick. He was swaying in the saddle, a puppet whose strings were being slowly cut. He turned his horse to head off astray, and the movement was his undoing. He did not fall. He simply emptied. He listed to one side, his hands slipping from the reins, and slid from the saddle. He hit the hard-packed earth with a dull, boneless thud. "Thomas!" Clara was off her horse in a second, running to him. He was on his back, his eyes closed. His breathing was a shallow, ragged gasp. His skin was on fire. When she touched his forehead, she recoiled from the heat. The bandage on his arm was soaked, and the smell of sickness was sharp in the cold air. He was unconscious. She was miles from the ranch, alone, with a man who was twice her size and a sky that threatened an early snow. Panic seized her. It was the same cold terror from the night of the wolf. She looked around at the vast, empty prairie. No one was coming. "No," she said aloud, "I will not." She tried to lift him. It was impossible. He was a dead weight, and she could not get purchase. She looked at his horse, a tall gelding named Stone. "Help me," she whispered to the unhearing man.
You have to help me.
She slapped his face. Once, twice, hard. Thomas, wake up! Wake up, damn you!
A low groan. His eyelids fluttered. He was not conscious, but he was reacting.
Get on the horse, she commanded, her voice high with desperation. She hauled his horse closer. She managed to get him to his knees, propping him against her own body. He was leaning on her, his full weight pressing her down. His head lolled against her shoulder. His skin burned her cheek. Just stand, she begged, sobbing with the effort. Help me stand. It took her an agonizing half-hour. It was a fight against gravity, against his unconsciousness, against her own despair. She used the stirrup, the saddle horn, her own shoulder. She pushed and pulled and heaved. He groaned, a sound of deep, buried pain. But somehow, some animal part of him understood. He moved, just enough. She got him, slumped like a sack of grain, face down across the saddle. She tied his hands loosely to the horn so he would not slide off. She left his horse's reins to trail, knowing the animal would follow. She mounted her own mare, her body shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. She led the gelding, step by agonizing step, back toward the ranch. Ruthie saw them coming. She was on the porch, a gray, still figure, and then she was running, as fast as her old legs would carry her, to open the gates.
The fire sickness,
Ruthie said, her voice grim, her hand on his burning forehead.
The old wound, the knife woke it up.
We have to get him inside, Clara panted. Not the barn, Ruthie said. He will die in that barn. Together, they hauled him from the horse. He was stirring now, muttering, his legs tangled, but he was not with them. They dragged him, his boots scraping the dirt, across the yard. They did not take him to the kitchen. They took him to the main house, to the cold, dark bedroom that had sat empty for years, the room that must have been his, once. They got him onto the bed, and he immediately thrashed, his good arm flailing. No, he muttered. No smoke, get out. Hush, child, Ruthie murmured, pulling his boots off. You are home. They fought the fever for 2 days and 2 nights. Clara did not sleep. She moved in a haze of exhaustion and terror. She and Ruthie took turns, but mostly Clara sat, wiping his face with cool, wet rags, forcing sips of water between his cracked, dry lips. He was not in the room with them. He was somewhere else. He was back in the war, back in the fire. He cried out. He did not shout, but his voice was a raw, broken plea. Helen, Helen, take my hand. The beam god. The beam is falling. Clara froze, the wet rag in her hand. Helen, the name from the photograph. Samuel, he cried out, his body arching off the bed, his eyes wide and unseeing. I am here. I am coming. The door it is blocked. I cannot. He would fall back, his breath sobbing in his chest. My fault. I was not there. I was supposed to. I failed. Clara sat in the dark, listening to the secrets of his soul spill out. Ruthie's story had been the facts. This was the truth. This was the raw, living guilt that had eaten him alive for more than a decade. He was trapped in that burning house, and he had never, ever escaped. Smoke, he whispered, turning his head, his scarred cheek stark against the white pillow. I cannot breathe, Helen. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Clara wept, silent tears tracking down her face. She wiped his forehead, trying to cool the inferno inside him. It is all right, Thomas, she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her. I am here. You are safe. The fire is out. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Clara had fallen asleep in the chair, her head on her arms. She woke to the sound of a different breath, a ragged but sane inhalation. She looked up. Thomas was staring at her. His good eye was clear. It was lucid, and it was filled with a profound, bottomless horror. He looked at his surroundings. He saw the unfamiliar, peeling wallpaper. He saw the old oak dresser. He was in the bedroom. He was in the house.
No,
he whispered. He tried to sit up, but the sickness had hollowed him out. He was as weak as a newborn. He fell back, his head hitting the pillow.
Clara.
His voice was a dry crackle. What?
You have been sick, she said,
her voice gentle. She stood and poured him a glass of water from the pitcher. A fever, from the wound in your arm. He stared at her exhausted, pale face. He looked at the empty bowl on the nightstand, the pile of stained rags. He saw that she had been nursing him. This violation of his solitude, this act of profound intimacy and care, seemed to shatter him. You should not have, he rasped, turning his face away.
The barn,
We could not, she said.
You would have died.
Ruthie said it was the fire sickness. His body went rigid. What did I say? Clara sat on the edge of the bed. She was too tired to be delicate. She had earned this. You talked, she said, in your sleep. You talked about the fire. You talked about Samuel. He shut his eyes, his face a mask of pain. And you talked about Helen, she said, her voice soft but insistent. You screamed for her. Thomas, who was Helen. He would not answer. He was a stone.
Thomas, tell me,
she demanded. It was not a plea. It was a command.
I sat here for 3 days. I listened to you beg her to take your hand. I listened to you tell Samuel you were coming. I know the story Ruthie told me, but I want to hear your story. Tell me.
He was silent for so long she thought he would not speak, that he would retreat back into that place he always went. When his voice came, it was a dead, flat thing. All the pain had been burned out of it, leaving only the ash. She was my brother's wife, he said, his eyes still closed. Samuel, he was young, so young. I told him not to enlist. I told him to stay. Protect his home, protect her. He took a ragged breath. I was stationed at the garrison, 10 miles away. I was the patrol leader. We were tasked with securing the homesteads. That was my job, to protect them, to protect him. His good hand clenched the blanket into a fist. We got word of raiders, deserters. They were moving south. I knew they would cross the river at the shallow fork. I knew it would take them right past Samuel's land. I told my commander. He did not listen. He sent my patrol on a fool's errand, hunting for whiskey for the officers' mess. His voice cracked. I should have defied him. I should have gone anyway. But I was a soldier. I followed orders. He was silent. Clara waited. When we got back, he whispered. I saw the smoke. I rode. I left my men. I rode until my horse's lungs gave out. I ran the last mile. He opened his eye. It was not looking at her. It was looking at the ceiling, at the burning house only he could see. It was the whole place. It was an inferno. They had those men. They had barred the door from the outside. I heard them. I heard Samuel. He was shouting, trying to break the door down.
And Helen, Clara whispered. She was screaming. I got to the door. I tried to break it. It was oak. I could not. I ran to the window. I broke it. I saw her. She was right there, just in sight.
His body was shaking, a fine, violent tremor. She was holding out her hand. I reached for her. I grabbed her. I was pulling her out. And the roof, the main beam, it came down right between us. He was sobbing now, dry, silent, agonizing sobs that shook his whole frame. It took her, the fire, it took her. It fell on me. The burning, I did not let go of her hand. Even when I could not, I did not let go. He raised his left hand, the scarred, puckered, ruined hand. My men pulled me out. I was on fire. I failed. I failed them. I let them die. I let them burn. He looked away from her, at the peeling wallpaper. His voice was dead again. I have been trying to pay for it ever since. Clara's heart broke. It broke not for his pain, but for his profound, misplaced guilt, for the debt he thought he owed. Her voice was thick with tears.
Thomas.
He would not look at her. He was locked in his own hell. She put her hand on his good arm. The muscle was thin, weak from the fever. Thomas, look at me. He turned his head. His eye was dead, empty. He was waiting for her judgment, for her disgust. She did something she had not even dreamed of doing. She lifted her legs onto the bed, her boots still on. She lay down on the blanket, beside him, her head on the pillow next to his. She was crying, but not for him, for both of them, for the cruelty of it, for the waste. He flinched, his body rigid, shocked by her presence beside him. She turned on her side to face him. She looked directly into his one clear eye. "You paid for me," she whispered. He stared at her. He did not understand. "You think you have been paying for them," she said, her voice shaking.
But you have been. You did. You saw me in that square. You saw me, and you ran into the fire again. Did you not?
He just stared. His breath caught in his chest.
You paid $1. She wept. You gave me a key. You gave me a choice.
You did not fail.
Thomas, you could not save them. But you saved me.
He looked at her, and for the first time, the deadness in his eye receded. A flicker of something life, a profound, shattering confusion. He lifted his good hand, the one that was not burned. It was shaking, just as it had in the kitchen. He slowly, so slowly, brought it to her face. He touched her cheek, his rough thumb brushing away a tear. He had never touched her face.
"Clara,"
he whispered. It was the first time he had said her name with anything but function. She did not move. She just let him touch her. He leaned in. It was a movement of inches, a movement that cost him every last bit of his strength. His face, his scarred, beautiful, ruined face, came closer. His lips, the one side perfect, the other pulled tight by the fire, touched hers. It was the gentlest thing she had ever known. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of questions. It was slow. It was unsure. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the dry, papery feel of his skin. It was two survivors, finally finding shore. He stayed there for a moment, his lips just resting on hers, as if he was afraid any pressure would break her. Then he began to pull back. The shame, the habit of a decade, was already reclaiming him. Clara, I am ruined," he breathed against her mouth. "I am not." His pulling away broke her fear. Her own terror of being touched, of being claimed, vanished. It was replaced by a fierce, sudden, protective need. This man would not run from her. Not again. She put her hand on the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp, unkempt hair. She held him.
"No,"
she whispered. She pulled away, just enough to see his eyes.
"Do not stop."
He looked lost.
"Just keep loving me,"
she said, the words tumbling out, the words from her dream.
"The way you have been, not like them, like you. Just keep loving me."
It was all the permission he needed, all the absolution he had craved. He kissed her again, and this time, it was not a question. It was an answer. It was slow. It was reverent. He was still weak, and she was taking the lead. Her old fear burned away by a need that was deeper than she had ever known. It was not urgency. It was a kind of holy, desperate reverence. He kissed her mouth, her cheek, her closed eyelids. His good hand traced the line of her jaw. She arched into his touch, her body, which had been a thing of shame, now waking up, alive and singing.
"Thomas,"
she breathed. She helped him with the buttons of his shirt. He fumbled with the laces of her dress. Their hands were clumsy, shaking. This was not the act she had seen in her nightmares, the brutal claiming that Elias Finch had promised. This was something else entirely. This was two people taking off their armor, piece by piece. He made love to her in the pale light of the sick room, his movements careful, gentle, almost worshipful. He was a man dying of thirst, finally given water. And she was not a victim. She was not property. She was Clara. She was herself. And she met his gentleness with a fierce, quiet hunger of her own. She was reclaiming her own body, her own soul, in the arms of the one man who had never tried to take them. When it was over, they did not speak. They lay tangled together, his head on her chest, his breath hot on her skin. She held him, her fingers stroking his hair, until he fell into a deep, true, healing sleep. Clara woke first. The sun was streaming through the window, bright and clear. The world was new. She had moved, somehow, in the night. She was now spooned against his back. He was still deeply asleep, his breathing even for the first time in days. She had been cold. She found a heavy wool blanket at the foot of the bed and had pulled it over both of them. And now, in the light of morning, she realized they were both fully clothed again. Sometime in the small, dark hours, as the cold crept in, they had found their clothes, dressing each other, dressing themselves, seeking not passion, but simple, animal warmth. She was pressed against him, his coat over his shirt, her dress pulled back on. They were fully, properly clothed, holding each other beneath the blanket. It was more intimate than the night before. It was the dream, made real. This was not a moment of heat. This was a morning of shelter. She smiled, a real, slow, happy smile. She felt safe. She heard him stir. His breathing changed.
Clara?
His voice was a sleepy, confused rumble.
I am here,
she whispered. He turned, slowly, to face her. His eye was clear, the fever gone. He looked at her, at the blanket, at their clothes. He looked confused, as if trying to piece together a dream.
I did not hurt you,
he whispered. It was his first, most important question.
No,
she said, her voice soft.
You saved me, Thomas.
I want to stay, she said, the words simple and true. I am not running. I want to stay, here. He just looked at her. His face, his scarred, beautiful face, began to change. The lines of pain, the deep-carved habits of guilt, softened. The pull of the scar on his mouth, which had always seemed a grimace, was lifted. He smiled. It was not the crinkle in his eyes she had seen once before. It was a true, wide, hesitant smile. It transformed him. It was like watching the sun break over a burnt landscape. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He did not speak. He just smiled and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulder. From the edge of the ranch, half a mile away, a figure sat on a tall, black horse. He held a pair of brass field glasses to his eyes. Elias Finch watched the small, clapboard house. He had been watching for an hour. He had seen the woman, his woman, go in and out of the house. He had seen the old woman. He had not seen Greaves. And then he saw them. They came out onto the porch together. The girl Clara, she was smiling. Greaves, the scarred, broken fool, was standing beside her. He looked different, stronger. Elias watched as Greaves leaned down and said something. He watched as the girl laughed, a real laugh, and put her hand on his good arm. He watched as the scarred man smiled, and placed his hand over hers. A cold, pure, acidic rage filled Elias Finch. This was not about a forged debt. This was not about a murdered old man. This was about defiance. She was his. That broken-down ranch was his. This was an insult that could not stand. He lowered the glasses, his fleshy face a mask of cold intent. He would not send lackeys again. He would come back, and he would burn them both to the ground. The peace of the new morning was a thin, brittle thing, easily broken. Thomas was healing. The fever was gone, but the weakness clung to him. A heavy, damp blanket. He had moved back to the barn, a compromise Clara had hated but understood. He could not yet live in the house that held his ghosts, but he no longer flinched when she brought him his coffee in the mornings. Sitting on a hay bale while he mended tack, they spoke in a new language, one of smiles and shared glances. The ranch felt, for the first time, like a home. They were in the yard, Clara feeding the chickens and Thomas mending a split corral rail, when the riders appeared. It was not two men this time. It was a procession. Elias Finch rode at the front, not on his usual black horse, but on a fine, high-stepping bay. Beside him, his badge gleaming in the morning sun, was Sheriff Hayes. Behind them were 4 deputies, all strangers, all carrying rifles across their saddles. They looked less like a posse and more like an occupying army. Clara's hand tightened on the feed sack. The chickens scattered as she stood up straight. Thomas laid his hammer down slowly, his body tensing. He was still weak. He knew it. He moved to stand in front of her, his limp pronounced, his good hand resting near his hip. His gun was in the barn. "Mr. Greaves," Elias called out, his voice oily and triumphant. He dismounted, not waiting for permission. He held a sheaf of papers. A fine morning for legal matters. "You have no business here, Finch," Thomas said, his voice low. "That is where you are wrong." Finch smiled, tapping the papers. "I have every business here. You see, I am a forgiving man. I overlooked your brutal assault on my associates, but I cannot overlook kidnapping. I cannot overlook the theft of property." "She is not your property," Thomas said. "That," Finch said, handing the papers to the sheriff, "is a matter of legal record." Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat, unrolling the top paper. "Thomas Greaves, I have here a warrant for your arrest. The charges are assault with intent to maim, kidnapping of a legal ward, and theft of bonded property." "What legal ward?" Clara demanded, stepping out from behind Thomas. Hayes's eyes slid over to her, his gaze holding the same cold assessment as the men at the auction. "Why, you—" "Miss Beaumont, I have here a contract of wardship, signed by your late father, placing you in the care of Mr. Finch here until all debts are paid. It seems your father, in his grief, knew he could not care for you and signed you over. Mr. Finch, as your legal guardian, paid your father's debts in full. You belong to him by law." "That is a lie," Clara cried, her voice shaking with rage. "He is a murderer. He forged those debts. He killed my father. I saw him." She took a step toward the sheriff, her hand outstretched. "You must listen to me. He put the gun in my father's hand. I saw him." Sheriff Hayes held up a gloved hand, his face a mask of bored contempt. "Miss Beaumont, your outburst is noted, but a woman sold for debt has no voice in this county. You are property, and property does not talk. It does not make accusations. Now be silent." The words hit Clara harder than a slap. She recoiled, speechless. All her progress, all her newfound strength, evaporated. She was back on the block. "Now, Greaves," Hayes continued, "you will come with us. The girl will be returned to her legal guardian, Mr. Finch." "No," Thomas said. He took a step back, pulling Clara with him. "No?" Finch laughed. "You have a choice. You can come peacefully, or my deputies can bring you. And they are not gentle men. They are not broken down, scarred old fools like you." Thomas did not move. He was a statue, his good hand now fisted at his side. He was calculating, sick, weak, and facing 6 armed men. It was a fire he could not escape. "Take him," Hayes ordered, with a bored wave. 2 of the deputies dismounted, their rifles still in hand. They advanced on Thomas. He moved. He was not as fast as he had been, but desperation fueled him. He lunged, not for the men, but for the corral rail he had been mending. He ripped the heavy pine board free and swung it like a club. He caught the first deputy across the chest, sending him sprawling. He turned on the second, but he was too slow. The man brought his rifle butt up. Catching Thomas square in the stomach, Thomas folded with a sickening gasp.
"Thomas!"
Clara screamed. As he fell to his knees, the other deputy, the one he had hit, scrambled up and slammed his own rifle stock across Thomas's back. Thomas collapsed, face down in the dirt. "Stop! You are killing him!" Clara lunged forward, but Elias Finch grabbed her, his fingers biting into her arm.
"He will learn his place,"
Finch hissed in her ear.
"and so will you."
The deputies dragged Thomas to his feet. He was barely conscious. Blood trickled from his mouth. They slammed him against his own corral fence, binding his hands. Ruthie had been standing on the porch, a silent, frozen witness. As Hayes and Finch turned their attention to the captured Thomas, as Clara struggled against Finch's grip, the old woman moved. She grabbed Clara's arm. Her grip was like iron.
"Not you, child,"
she whispered, her voice fierce.
"Not you. Screaming ain't helpin'. Riding will."
"What?" Clara sobbed, trying to pull away. "You heard me. You cannot stop this, but you can finish it. Go!" Ruthie ordered. She shoved Clara, hard, toward the barn. "Go now, while they are busy with him. Take the mare." "Go where?" Clara was frantic. "Covenant Creek, 2 towns over. You find Judge Josiah Reed. He is a federal judge. He knew Mr. Samuel. He knew his family. Tell him everything. Now, go!" Clara looked at Thomas. He was being beaten. His head snapped back as one of the deputies struck him across the face. She looked at Finch, who was laughing. She looked at Ruthie, whose dark eyes were boring into her, full of a desperate, cold fire. A choice, just like the coins in the gun, stay and be captured, or run and save him. Her decision was instant. She ripped her arm from Finch's grasp. He was too surprised to hold her, and she ran. "The girl is escaping!" a deputy yelled. "Let her go!" Finch shouted, laughing. "The wolves will get her, or she will crawl back. It does not matter. We have what we came for." Clara burst into the dim, cool barn. She did not stop to think. She did not stop for fear. She grabbed the bridle and slammed the bit into Dust's mouth. The mare shied, but Clara's hands were firm. She threw the saddle on, her hands tying the cinch in the same practiced knots Thomas had taught her. She remembered the tin box where he slept. She ran to the small, clean stall he had made his room. There it was, under his blanket. The tin box. She grabbed it. She ran back to the horse, her heart hammering. A thought. The gun. The Navy Colt. It was on a peg by the door. She grabbed it, shoving it deep into her father's old trousers, the ones Ruthie had given her. She led the mare to the back of the barn, the side that faced the open prairie. She threw the heavy wooden bar and hauled the doors open. She mounted, not from a block, but leaping, her foot finding the stirrup, and swung her leg over, just as he had taught her. She kicked the mare, hard. Dust leaped forward, and they were gone. A spray of dirt, galloping flat out toward the eastern ridge. She did not look back. She could not. If she looked back, she would stop. And if she stopped, he was a dead man. The ride to Purgatory Springs was a short, brutal affair. Thomas was slung over a saddle, his hands tied. He was conscious, but he did not speak. He just endured. They threw him in the town's single, filthy jail cell. It was not a cell, it was a cage. Sheriff Hayes locked the door. Trial will be tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, here in the saloon. Do not suppose you will need a lawyer. Greaves seems pretty clear-cut. Thomas said nothing. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the rank, straw-covered floor. His head throbbed. His stomach was a knot of agony. His arm, the fever, was coming back. He could feel the heat, the familiar, sick throb. But it was not the pain that worried him. It was Clara. He had seen her run, He had seen Finch let her go. The wolves will get her. Or she will crawl back. He was back in the fire. He was helpless. He had failed. Again. Night fell. The jail was dark, cold, and smelled of despair. He heard footsteps. A lantern beam cut through the darkness, followed by the smell of expensive cigar smoke. Elias Finch pulled a stool up to the bars. He sat down, lit his cigar, and smiled. "Cozy?" he asked. Thomas did not look at him. He stared at the patch of moonlight on the floor. "She is a spirited one," Finch mused, puffing smoke. "I like that. It will make the breaking of her all the more satisfying. She is out there now, you know, alone, on the prairie." Thomas's good hand clenched. "It is cold tonight," Finch said, as if discussing the weather. "The wolves are hungry. I imagine she is very, very afraid. Or maybe she is just lost. She will not last 2 days. She will be back, begging for food, begging for shelter." Finch leaned closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, poison-laced whisper. "And when she does, I will give it to her. I will give her a hot bath and a silk dress and a fine, soft bed. My bed. And while she is in it, I will tell her how you begged for your life. I will tell her how you cried when the deputies hit you. I will describe, in detail, how you broke. You scarred piece of filth. I will make her see you as you are, weak, a failure." Thomas turned his head. He looked at Finch. His one good eye was a pit of such cold, quiet hatred that Finch physically recoiled, his smile faltering. "She will not be back," Thomas whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Oh," Finch recovered, sneering. "And where will she go? Where can she go? I own this land. I own the law. I own you. By 10 o'clock tomorrow, I will own your ranch, too, and I will burn that barn of yours to the ground, with all your memories in it." Finch stood, tossing his cigar onto the cell floor. "Sleep well, Greaves. It is your last night on this earth." Clara rode until the mare was slick with sweat and foam. She rode through the night, the moon her only guide. She was cold. She was terrified. And she was alone. The howling of the wolves, the same sound that had sent her running back to the cabin, was all around her. But this time, she did not run from it. She held the Navy Colt in her hand, its cold weight a comfort, and she kept the mare at a steady, ground-eating trot. She did not just have fear. She had a purpose. She had the tin box, heavy in her saddlebag, and she had Ruthie's words. Judge Josiah Reed. She arrived in Covenant Creek just after dawn, 2 days later. She was not a woman. She was a creature of dust and desperation. Her hair was a matted tangle. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She fell from the mare, her legs buckling, and hauled the horse to a public trough. She found the Federal Building. It was a proper brick building, the only one in town, with a large, polished sign. She stumbled up the steps. "I need to see Judge Reed," she said to the clerk at the desk. The man looked up, his nose wrinkling at the sight of her. "The judge does not see vagrants. You have an appointment?" "No," Clara said, her voice raw. "You do not understand. A man is going to be murdered. His name is Thomas Greaves. He is in Purgatory Springs." "Purgatory Springs," the clerk scoffed. "That mess is out of our jurisdiction, ma'am. That is a county matter." "His name is Thomas Greaves," she shouted, her last thread of control snapping. "His brother was Samuel Greaves. Tell him Samuel's brother is going to be hanged by Elias Finch." The name Elias Finch meant nothing. The name Samuel Greaves did. An old, stern voice came from an open office door. "What did you say?" Clara turned. Judge Josiah Reed was an old man, tall and thin as a fence post, with a shock of white hair and eyes as clear and cold as a winter morning. "I said, Samuel Greaves's brother is in trouble," Clara panted. The judge stared at her. "I knew Samuel Greaves. His father was a friend of mine. Long ago. Who are you? My name is Clara Beaumont. Please, sir. There is no time. She unslung her saddlebag and dumped the tin box onto the clerk's desk. The scorched tin type slid out, along with a packet of folded oilskin-wrapped papers. The judge's eyes fixed on the photograph. He picked it up, his thumb gently touching the image of the young, smiling boy in the uniform.
Samuel,
he breathed. And Helen, his face hardened. I heard what happened to them. A disgrace. He looked at Clara.
Who is this man?
Thomas Greaves, his brother.
He was there. He tried to save them.
She pushed the papers toward him. These are his war papers, his discharge. The judge opened the packet. He read, his face growing darker with every line. He read the service record. He read the commendations. He read the final, honorable discharge, and the military surgeon's report on the fire. Conspiracy, he muttered. Fraud, murder. He looked up, his eyes blazing. He was no longer a frail old man. He was the law. This Elias Finch, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He is using a bought sheriff to seize this man's land.
Yes,
Clara wept, relief flooding her.
And he is going to hang him today, at 10 o'clock.
The judge looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8. It is a 4-hour ride, full gallop. He slammed his hand on the desk. Mr. Tibbs, fetch Marshal Kane. Tell him to bring his rifle and 2 deputies. Tell him we ride on a matter of federal conspiracy. And get this girl some coffee and a fresh horse. She rides with us. The saloon in Purgatory Springs was full. It was 10 o'clock. Elias Finch had provided free whiskey, and the room was loud. Thomas was dragged in, his hands bound. He could barely stand. The fever was burning him up. He was leaned against the bar. Sheriff Hayes sat at a table, a gavel in his hand. Elias Finch sat beside him, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. This here is a legal hearing, Hayes announced, banging the gavel. Thomas Greaves, you are charged with theft, kidnapping, and assault. He is guilty, Finch said, taking a drink. I find him guilty. Hayes agreed. Sentenced to be hanging, effective immediately. The crowd cheered. 2 of Finch's men grabbed Thomas, dragging him toward the door, where a rope was already waiting. Looped over the saloon's high porch beam. Stop! The saloon doors slammed open. They hit the walls with a crash that silenced the room. Judge Josiah Reed stood in the doorway, his black coat covered in dust. Beside him stood a tall, grim-faced man with a federal marshal's star on his chest. And behind them, her face pale but set, her hand on the Navy Colt at her hip, was Clara. What mockery is this? The judge's voice boomed, cutting through the whiskey-soaked air. Sheriff Hayes stood up, his face pale. Judge Reed, what is the meaning of this? This is county business. This is federal business, you corrupt fool, Reed roared, advancing into the room. I am Judge Josiah Reed, United States Federal Court. I have seen evidence of a conspiracy to defraud, to murder, and to steal the property of a decorated Union veteran. Marshal, take that man's badge. The marshal moved, his hand on his gun. Hayes, his face ashen, fumbled with his star. Now, see here. Give him the badge. Hayes! Finch snarled. Standing up, his legal trap was gone. He was cornered. Elias Finch, the judge said, his voice cold. You are under arrest for the murder of Amos Beaumont, for forgery, and for conspiracy against a federal veteran. You have no power here, old man, Finch bellowed. His hand dived inside his coat. He was not aiming for the judge. He was aiming for Clara. She was the one who had done this. He pulled the gun. Clara, Thomas roared. He was too weak. He was too far, but he was not helpless. The saloon's fireplace was roaring, a fire against the morning chill. resting in the embers, where the barkeep heated his poker for drinks, was a long iron branding iron, its tip glowing a dull, menacing red. Thomas did not think. He moved. It was the fire, all over again. It was Helen's hand. It was Clara's face. He lunged, grabbing the iron from the fire. The handle was scorching hot, searing his scarred, numb left hand, but he did not feel it. Elias fired. The bullet went wild, smashing a mirror behind the bar. Thomas was not trying to kill him. He was not trying to fight. He was a shield. He lunged between Finch and Clara, his body breaking Finch's line of sight. He swung the branding iron, not as a club, but as a desperate, final block. The glowing red-hot iron, the ranch's G brand, met Elias Finch's gun hand. A sound filled the saloon, a terrible, wet, popping sizzle. It was the sound of a man's scream, high and thin, blended with the sound of his own flesh boiling. Finch dropped, his gun clattering to the floor, his hand a smoking, ruined, blackened claw. He writhed on the sawdust, screaming, his power, his menace, his very identity burned away in a single, agonizing moment. The saloon was dead silent, save for his animal sounds. The marshal had his gun on the deputies. "It is over." He looked at Hayes. "Put that man in his own cell," he said, motioning to Finch. "And cuff this one. They will ride to Denver for a federal trial." Thomas stood, swaying, the branding iron clattering from his hand. The adrenaline was gone. He was on his knees. He was bloodied from the beating. His shirt was soaked with fever sweat, and his left hand, it was burned. Again, in the same place. He looked up. Clara was there. She did not see the judge. She did not see the cuffed sheriff. She did not see the screaming, maimed monster on the floor. She only saw him. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the blood and sawdust and spilled whiskey. She grabbed his face with both her hands, her eyes searching his. He was alive. He was here. He looked at her, his one good eye clear, the fever haze burned away by the fight. He had not failed. He had not run. He had been her shield. Clara touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his good cheek. "We do not run anymore," she whispered. It was not a question. It was a vow. It was the end of the debt. It was the end of the fire. Time does not heal all wounds. It does not erase the scar, and it does not quiet the memory of the blade. But it gives the wound space to close. It gives the scar room to fade from a raw, red thing to a pale, silver line. The seasons turned on the high plains. The winter that followed the fight in the saloon was hard. The snows deep, the wind a constant, sharp howl. But it was not a winter of fear. It was a winter of survival, and, for the first time, of shared warmth. Elias Finch and Sheriff Hayes were gone, tried and convicted in a federal court in Denver, their names becoming a dark, whispered story in Purgatory Springs. The saloon had a new owner, a quiet man who watered his whiskey and closed on Sundays. The town, without its bully, began to breathe. On the Greaves Ranch, the change was more profound. The first, most important change was that Thomas moved into the house. He had stood at the threshold of the main bedroom, the one he had been sick in, the one that had been his parents' and then his brother's. He stood there for a full minute, his hand on the doorframe, his face a mask of old pain. Clara stood behind him, her hand on his back, not pushing, just present. "They are gone, Thomas," she said softly. "But you are not. You live. It is time to live here." He had walked in, and he had stayed. They slept in that bed together, his long, scarred body curled around hers, a living shield against the cold and the nightmares. The ghosts were still there. Samuel and Helen were in the scorched tintype, which they kept on the mantel, but they were memories now, not haunts. The ranch was still poor. The spring thaw revealed fences that needed mending. a barn roof that needed patching, and a herd that was thin and hungry. But the work was different. It was no longer a silent, solitary labor. It was shared, where before Thomas had worked in a grim, punishing silence. Now there was talk. It was not much, at first. "The fence at the north pasture is down. We need to clear the rock from the new field. The mare looks ready to foal." And then, one day, as Thomas was trying to fix a stubborn well pump, wrestling with the rusted handle, Clara brought him a dipper of water. He drank, and as he handed it back, he misjudged, and the cold water splashed down the front of his shirt. He froze, expecting something, a flinch, an apology. Clara just looked at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, and a small, suppressed giggle escaped her. He looked down at himself, then at her face, at the mischief in her eyes, and he smiled, that new, true, hesitant smile. "I suppose," he rasped. "I needed cooling." The sound of his own dry wit surprised him as much as it did her, and she laughed, the same bright, clear laugh that had surprised him in the pasture, and he laughed with her. A rough, unused, rusty sound. It was the best sound the ranch had ever heard. The laughter, it seemed, was a signal. One afternoon in early summer, a woman appeared. She was not riding. She was walking, her shoes worn through, her dress stained with dust and tears. She was young, barely 20, with a fresh, dark bruise on her temple. She stopped at the edge of the yard, looking at Thomas, who was shoeing a horse. She was terrified. Clara saw her from the kitchen window. She dried her hands on her apron and walked out, wiping the flour from her hands. "Can we help you, miss?" Clara asked. The woman flinched, as if expecting a blow. I heard," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. "In town. They said a man was run out. They said this place you—" Clara looked at her. She did not see a stranger. She saw herself, standing on a platform, her soul turned to stone. She saw the leering faces. "My name is Sarah," the woman whispered. My contract holder, he said I was his, he—" Clara held up a hand. "You do not have to," she said. She turned and walked, not to the main house, but to the small, spare cabin by the cottonwoods. It was clean, the bed made. Clara had kept it just so. She walked back to the girl. She held out her hand. In it was a heavy black iron key. "This is the spare cabin," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "It locks from the inside." The woman, Sarah, stared at the key as if it was a solid gold bar. She took it, her hand shaking. I have no money," she whispered. "We do not trade in women here." Clara said, "You can rest, you can work, you can leave. The choice is yours. You are safe here." Sarah was the first. She was not the last. The Greaves Ranch became a rumor, a whisper, a haven. It was a waypoint on a new secret railroad, one that did not lead north to freedom from slavery, but west, to freedom from men who believed a piece of paper and a few dollars gave them the right to own a life. Clara helped them. She taught them what Thomas had taught her: how to shoot, how to ride, how to work the land. But she taught them something else. She taught them to read. She sat with them in the kitchen, her old books from her father's store spread out, and she taught them their letters. She taught them how to sign their own names. She taught them how to have a voice. Thomas, too, became a different man. His own torment had quieted, and in its place, a deep, steady patience grew. The cruelty had been burned out of him, leaving only the strength. The town boys, the ones who were half wild, the ones whose fathers were mean with drink or had simply vanished, they started to drift out to the ranch. They were drawn by the horses, but they were held by Thomas. He taught them how to farm, but he taught them without cruelty, as the outline had said. Clara watched him one afternoon with a young boy named Eli, A thin, nervous child who was terrified of the horses. Thomas was showing him how to gentle the new foal. "He will not listen," Eli complained, after the foal had shied from him for the 10th time. "You are shouting," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble.
"I am not."
"Your body is," Thomas said. "You stand like you expect a kick, so the horse thinks maybe I should kick." He knelt, moving slow. His scarred hand held out, palm down. "You do not break a horse's spirit. That is what cruel men do. Weak men, they break things to make themselves feel big." He looked at the boy, his good eye clear. A strong man, he does not need to break anything. He earns its trust. You stand quiet. You let him see you. You let him know you are not the fire. You are the shelter. The foal, curious, edged closer and nuzzled his scarred, outstretched hand. The boy's eyes went wide. Thomas Greaves was teaching the next generation of men how to be something other than what had broken him. Ruthie stayed. She was the immovable, quiet center of their new, strange, growing family. The kitchen was her domain, and it was no longer a cold, empty room. It was loud. It was full of the chatter of the women Clara was helping, the clatter of the boys Thomas was feeding. Ruthie sat at the table, a bowl of beans in her lap, a quiet, knowing smile on her face. She had become a grandmother to all of them. She taught the girls how to bake bread that would rise, and she taught the boys how to listen to their elders. She watched Thomas and Clara move around each other, a simple touch of his hand on her back as he passed, a smile she saved only for him.
"The Lord,"
Ruthie would mutter to her kneading bowl.
"He surely does work in slow, strange ways, but he gets there. He gets there."
One day, a wagon rattled into the yard. It was a man with a black box on a tripod, a traveling photographer. He offered to take a portrait, immortalized by the very sun itself, for $2. Clara, her hands on her hips, her face bright, insisted.
Thomas, we must have one, a proper one."
Thomas hated it. He hated the idea of standing still, of being looked at, of having his scars captured on a piece of tin. "Clara, it is a waste of money."
"It is not,"
she said, her voice soft. She touched his scarred cheek, an act that was now as natural as breathing.
"The world should see you as I do."
They stood on the porch of the main house. Clara, in her best calico dress, her hair pinned up, stood tall. She was not the bitter, bruised girl from the auction block. Her chin was high, her eyes clear. She was the matron of a haven. She was a woman who had been remade. Thomas stood beside her, stiff and uncomfortable in his clean shirt. He was staring at the photographer, who was hidden under a black cloth, as if he were facing a firing squad. "Sir," the photographer's muffled voice called out, If you could put your arm around the missus, just for a moment." Thomas froze. His whole body went rigid.
This was a public thing, a declaration."
He looked at Clara. She just waited, her small, calm smile on her face. She did not pressure him. She simply put her hand on the center of his chest. She felt his heart, a strong, steady beat beneath her palm. He took a breath. He let it out. His good arm, his right arm, came around her waist. He pulled her in, tight against his side. It was not a hesitant touch. It was a claim. It was a public, final, undeniable statement. This woman is mine. This land is mine. We are here. We have survived. The photographer's flash pan went off with a bright, sudden whoosh of light and smoke. The image was captured, a new photograph for the mantelpiece, not of a past lost to fire, but of a future, whole and unburned. That night, Clara sat by the fireplace. The nights were cold, and the fire in the hearth, the one he had once feared, was now the center of their home. Thomas was asleep in his chair, his head back, his breathing deep and peaceful. The fever, the fire sickness, had never returned.
Clara had a piece of paper and a pencil in her lap. She was writing,
To Clara Beaumont. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about a dusty square, and the feeling of 1,000 eyes on her, and the shame of a single dollar. She wrote about the feeling of being ruined, of being dirty, of being worthless. She wrote about the cold, empty prairie and the howl of the wolf. You thought you were ruined, she wrote, her pencil scratching in the quiet room. You thought your life was over. You thought you were just a piece of property, bought and paid for. She looked at Thomas, at the way the firelight played over his sleeping, scarred face. She thought of his pain, and her own, and the way they had, somehow, slotted together, two broken pieces making a whole. You were not saved from the fire, she wrote, a new, clear thought forming. You were saved by it. It burned away the world you knew. It burned away your pride. It burned away everything but the very bones of you. And you found out you were strong. You were not saved by Thomas. You were saved with him. She looked at the last line she had written. You are not ruined. She smiled, a tear tracing a slow path down her cheek. She picked up the pencil and added 3 final words. You are remade. She folded the letter. She did not need to keep it. She stood, walked to the iron stove, and opened the small grate. She dropped the letter inside. She watched the edges curl, turn black, and flare into a bright, clean orange flame. The words, and the pain they held, turned to ash. She was free. An hour later, they stood outside. The autumn night was sharp, the air so cold and clear it felt like breathing glass. The sky was a black velvet spill, overflowing with stars. It was the same vast, terrifying sky she had run from on her first night. Now, it just looked peaceful. I used to hate the prairie, she said, her voice a small cloud in the air. I thought it was empty. Just a big, empty, lonely place. Thomas came to stand behind her. He did not speak for a moment, just looked up at the river of stars. It is not empty, he rasped, his voice soft. It is just waiting, waiting for life. Clara smiled. I'm glad you said that. She took his hand, his good hand, calloused and warm. She guided it, not to her waist, not to her shoulder. She placed it flat, her own hand over his, on her lower belly. He went still. The night was utterly silent, save for the faint, far-off whisper of the wind. He did not understand. He looked from the sky, down to her, his face a question. She pressed his hand down. Just a little. It is still small, so small, she whispered. But it is here. His breath hitched. He stared at his hand, resting on her, as if it were a miracle he could not comprehend. She looked up at his face, at the way his good eye widened, at the sudden, sharp intake of his breath. You ready? She whispered. For one more reason to live. He made a sound. It was a choked, broken sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The man of few words was now a man of no words at all. He pulled his hand away, and for one terrible second, she thought he was afraid. But he was not retreating. He grabbed her hand. He lifted it to his lips. He turned it over, and, his eyes never leaving hers, he kissed her knuckles. He kissed the palm that had been cut by the key. He kissed her, his lips trembling, a desperate, silent, holy vow. He pulled her back against his chest, his good arm and his scarred arm wrapped around her, holding her as if she were the only anchor in the world. He put his chin on the top of her head. He was shaking. He took his heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door and draped it over her shoulders. Pulling it tight around them both, they stood there, 2 small figures in a vast land, under a universe of stars. The prairie wind, the one that had once carried only dust and hunger, blew soft against their faces, carrying nothing, now, but peace. We thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment where you are listening from and connect with other listeners. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share this story with someone you know.